Welcome to FIL Your Boots. Covering critical times of the season, FIL hosts industry experts, colleagues, and most importantly, local farmers like yourself, bringing you useful insights and different perspectives to help you drive performance on farm.
Welcome to another episode in FIL Your Boots, the FIL podcast series. I'm Colin May, Global Hygiene Support Specialist for GEA, and today I've got with me Natasha Maguire from Farm Medics. And this episode is about teat sprays and the effectiveness and some of the work Natasha's done around that. So welcome again, Natasha. Good to have you here again. You know, you've done a lot of testing of cows in New Zealand now, probably individual cow testing, as much as anybody has done. And I think you started to find a common trend that drove a desire to find more out around teat spraying and the effectiveness of it. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's correct. We started seeing a pattern with Staph aureus in herds, where herds had particularly bad problems with Staph aureus, that it was often associated with the use of, or long-term use of, chlorhexidine teat sprays.
If you look at other markets around the world, and you know, I've spent time in the US, there is virtually no chlorhexidine used up in that market. What's the main actives up in there?
There's really a whole variety of actives that are used up there. So there are iodines, there are chlorine dioxides, there are lactic acids, there's glycolic acids, there's anything you can imagine. Even one of them is a weed killer.
A weed killer, that's awesome.
was used up there, to my surprise. So there's all kinds of things.
Is the challenge different to ours?
Yes, there is a lot more challenges, especially around the gram-negative bacteria and, or perhaps the loading of gram-negatives and streptococci. So from the, most cows in the US are confinement, so they're housed in barns, and the bedding becomes particularly dirty. So I think our fresh air and sunshine, we get away with more.
So when you say gram-negative, that is what type?
Oh, sorry, E. coli in particular, I would say would be more of a challenge in the US than it is here. It doesn't mean it's not a challenge here too at times, but in the US it's definitely an ongoing challenge.
So that's something for farmers to think about in New Zealand as we move towards some confinement and feed pads, that sort of thing. Those cows will be susceptible to different pathogens.
Not necessarily different pathogens, but there'll be more of them.
More concentrated.
Definitely. Anytime we increase our density stocking rate, more cows per square metre, you're going to have more E. coli.
So you found this trend with herds that have been using chlorhexidine for long periods of time, had higher instances of Staph aureus. So from there, what did you decide to do? But if we track back, there's tests that were in place in New Zealand for testing teat spray efficacy prior to that, which was Protocol A, which we used to use until about 2014, and we went to EN 1656. So first off, tell us about Protocol A. How was that done?
So Protocol A was a method where teats were actually excised. They were cut off cows. So not real cows, of course. They were cows that were being processed for meat, I guess. And those teats were then taken and they would inoculate the skin of the teats with bacteria. They would then, teat spray, and then they would recover the bacteria. And that's how they sort of looked at the disinfectant efficacy. But those sort of trials are really, really hard to compare because it might depend on when you get the teats and, which cows they were slaughtered from. And if you end up with a particularly rough batch of teats, you could get reasonably variable results. And I think some of that work that was done will be done really well. Labs like Dairy NZ, really, really thorough. John Williamson's absolutely meticulous in what he does. But, perhaps other organisations that may have been more sloppy. Yeah. And so moving to EN 1656, meant that there was more of a consistent approach, that we're doing things in a test tube, if you like, not, on actual skin. But that does create some differences too. So,
and where did the EN 1656 test originate? It is a test for cows.
Well, that's an interesting story. No, it's not. It was actually sort of extrapolated, if you like, or extended from disinfectant standard testing for hard surfaces. So quite a different application. It's a disinfection of surfaces that have been cleaned as well. So straight away, you can see that there's some difference between perhaps something that was designed for use of a cleaned hard surface in a, let's say, a hospital setting, and maybe somebody's vomited on the floor or something like that. That's been cleaned, and now we want to disinfect it. That's quite different from, a cow shed.
Yeah. So you looked at those tests, and then this, originally you thought it could be Staph aureus resistance to chlorhexidine, but you've gone away and done some work and some testing on that. What have you got out of that?
Yeah. So the work that we've done, we were worried about resistance, and we're still not sure that may be part of the issue, but certainly bacteria.
Do we see resistance to chlorhexidine in the medical industry and in places like that? Because it's widely used there, and it is a restricted active.
It's a really restricted active. So, I had a chat to Susie Wiles. She's pretty well known.
Lady on the TV, yes.
Yeah, so she's pretty well known for her, nominated for New Zealand of the Year, a very, very knowledgeable person. And I discussed this with her, and she was horrified to hear that chlorhexidine was being used as a teat spray, and thought that was really inappropriate use. So this is something that we rely on, surgical sites that we're going to. But once again, the skin is cleaned. Chlorhexidine's used. Often they'll use iodine and chlorhexidine. So in a surgical scrub setting, when you scrub up before surgery, you'll probably use both those things, not one or the other. And chlorhexidine obviously is used, on skin. So we're using that, and then we're using it in a completely different field where we've got an opportunity to develop resistance. She just thought that was nuts.
Wow. So you went away and you've done some testing.
I guess what was interesting to us was, is it that the chlorhexidine doesn't work against the staph, or what is the problem? And what we realised was that, the whole EN 1656 is actually a pretty soft test. So, one of the things we realised pretty quickly was like a 5 log reduction is not that high. And what's interesting is it's given a 5-minute time. So in the context of teat spraying, we don't want to wait 5 minutes for a disinfectant to work. We actually want a disinfectant to work reasonably quickly.
So the teat canal will be closed in 5 minutes at most.
The teat canal, obviously, that's variable how long it closes over. But the sooner, like if I was to, vomit here and now over you, you wouldn't wait 5 minutes to have it removed. You'd be wanting it off now.
Yeah.
And if you've got a body fluid from another person or animal or whatever on you, like a cow in the situation of milking, you've got milk from another cow potentially on your teats. The sooner we spray that, the sooner the pathogens are dying, and the less opportunity they have to, as the teat canal closes, get inside the teat canal. So to me, it's one of the biggest ways to control mastitis is post-milking teat spraying. It's really, really important. So the sooner that can happen, surely the better it is. Waiting 5 minutes, if something's going to work in 30 seconds versus 5 minutes, if I was a farmer, if I was the cow, I would be wanting the 30-second option, not the 5-minute option.
Seems pretty realistic.
So for that reason, like what we realised that EN 1656 is really a test that's been adapted from a long time ago. And there was other surprises that we discovered, like they recommend actual strains of bacteria to use.
Right.
So one of the interesting things that we found was when we use strains from New Zealand cows versus the strains that the test prescribed.
Yes.
So when you do 1656, you have to use these strains. We found that the strains in every single case that were used in 1656 were easier to kill than the ones that we found on the cows.
Right. Well, what do you put that down? So cow bacteria, where did the ECN 1656 bacteria come from?
Well, the three that are prescribed in 1656, we have to test with E. coli, we have to test with strep uterus, and we have to test with Staph aureus. The first one I looked at was Staph aureus, and that came from a French institute in the 1950s. So that's a long time ago. And we do know that bacteria evolve. Like their reproductive cycle is every 20 minutes, so their evolution is much faster than ours. So to me, it seemed wrong, and it maybe explains some things. Like, why are these products that we tested capable of passing this standard, a standard that perhaps my own urine could pass, yet when we used bacteria from cows in New Zealand, it just didn't work. It just didn't make sense. So what I learned was that the 1656, once again, adapted from disinfectants for hard surfaces, that those bacteria were, in the case of Staph aureus, from a human lesion. In the case of E. coli, was also from a person. The strep uberis was a cow strain. But all of those strains of bacteria were very old. The strep uberis actually came from the 40s.
It was a human strain from the 40s.
The strep uberis was probably a cow strain, but from the 40s.
Wow.
But the other two, E. coli and Staph aureus, were human strains, and they were from the 50s. Very, very old strains of bacteria.
So what you're saying is that EN 1656, which is the benchmark that companies like ourselves have to use, is set very low. It's
a pretty low bar, yeah.
Low bar.
So we wanted to develop something that was a little more realistic in terms of the challenge, the number of bacteria that were there, and also like using actual cow strains of bacteria.
So 5 log, EN 1656 is 5 log. So for our listeners, that's 100,000 bacteria.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lot.
It sounds like a lot.
Is that realistic?
We think, in just a few milligrams of manure, you can have millions, for example, of E. coli.
Millions.
And if you look around a cow shed, there's more than a few milligrams of manure. There's quite a lot. So we think, obviously, this challenge is variable. At certain times of the year, and with our seasonal system, spring, for example, you're going to have a lot of challenge. It's going to be really heavy. And one of the other interesting things that we noticed was that chlorhexidine seemed to react really badly with milk. Now, I don't know, in 1656, it says that you have to use milk in the mix, and we observed that with chlorhexidine, often it just reacted in such a way that locked up the chlorhexidine, so it wasn't no longer there active as well.
That's a really interesting point you make, because we even see that on farms with different water types.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a hard water, alkaline water, that can really precipitate the chlorhexidine out, and that clearly is taking levels of active out. So you might be starting at 5,000 ppm, you might drop to 3,000.
Yes, quite possibly. And in the US, it was documented that chlorhexidine is inactivated as well by organic matter. So organic matter, that's soil, manure, all those things,
which are
they're like present on teats, especially at challenge times like spring. You've got a lot of that.
So you looked at those, you developed a different test, you went away. I believe from that you've tested several products from the New Zealand marketplace and done quite a few out of the US that were sent down from the US, which were different actives. From that, what were some of the conclusions you made?
I think some of the conclusions that are made is it's really important to know what challenges the herd face to decide best what teat spray to use. That's something important because it was variable. In general, the iodines performed incredibly well. So the iodines worked really, really well, but it wasn't across the board. So what was surprising to us, my background's in microbiology and biochemistry, I would have thought that something that was 3,000 ppm iodine versus something else that was 3,000 ppm iodine would give an identical result. And I couldn't have been more wrong. To me, that was a real surprise. So sometimes iodines perform really well, and sometimes we had iodines at 3,000 ppm that outperformed iodines at 9,000 ppm from the US.
Wow.
Other times we had, some local products here that they just didn't work as well for whatever reason, and I'm not sure why. They titrated as that active, but they just didn't work.
So there was some definite efficacy differences from product to product.
Product to product. So what we were doing was we developed like a breakpoint test where we were actually pushing these products so hard with so much challenge to a point where they failed. And that's what we wanted to see. Where do they fail? Like, is it, and really putting the pressure on them. So to be fair, this is not casting any dispersion over the products for their current claims because they passed 1656, which is the required regulation. But like I say, we're pushing it that bit further.
Yeah.
And what we found was a little bit of a surprise. Yeah.
Wow. So what you just said was, farmers, again, you need to be a little bit more prescriptive with what you're dealing with. And you've tested efficacy, which is one part of a teat spray. Something we might talk about in a few minutes is emollient, because that's different again, and that has a different function. But certainly with efficacy, if you're dealing with E. coli, or let's say Staph aureus, that's the infectious one that post sprays really have to deal with. what is your suggestion there? What did you find? Higher levels of iodine, is it with?
Yeah, iodine definitely brings control. And I liken Staph aureus, iodine and Staph aureus, like iodine is it's an oxidant. The way it works is like fire. So it goes through and scorches everything, and then it's gone. It's consumed. It's consumed with organic matter. It doesn't persist. So it doesn't have a protective action, sort of particularly after milking for a very long time. But at that time, it works incredibly well.
Works fast and quick?
Fast and quick, yeah.
No residual?
Well, there's bound to be like a slight residual effect for some time, but for how long, we don't really know. We didn't, obviously, can't follow that. That's almost an impossible experiment. Yeah. But in terms of the chlorhexidine, it inhibits. What we found was really interesting. It inhibits, but it doesn't actually kill. Yeah. So we're not getting the bacteria dying, which is a fundamental problem.
So that's the efficacy of teat sprays. What about some? We haven't got chlorine. We've got chlorine dioxide just been released in New Zealand actually now for the goat industry. Effective?
Mm-hmm.
Are they effective?
Yeah, they can be effective. We noticed a difference even between chlorine dioxides.
Well, yeah.
So it's not just about what it says on the label, which is, it's surprising. And I guess we got to give chemists a bit of credit here. There's obviously some formulation secrets that they have that make their products more efficacious than others. And like I said, we had an iodine in New Zealand 3,000 odd ppm test better than 9,000 ppm from the States. So, I mean, how does that happen? Obviously, there's more to it than just
there's
the active
ingredients in there.
Yeah.
That'll do it.
Yeah.
We talk about efficacy of teat sprays in the actives, but another big part of them is emollient.
Mm-hmm.
So emollient is critical in preventing certain pathogens.
I think emollient is a whole different kettle of fish, and I guess what I would say is the testing that we did in the lab was in the lab. We didn't use it on any cows. So the ultimate test is what happens in the field, but field trials are incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
And obviously they're flawed as well because it depends on when the field trial is done as to what the challenge will be. So you may get really mixed results from a field trial too, which may make them less appealing and interesting for people to do. So I think a lab test is the way to go, but in the same time at the lab we're not assessing, let's say for example, if you spray the cow with this chemical, all we're looking at is that it kills bacteria. We're not paying any attention to the effect that it has on the cow.
The teat condition.
We can't assess that in the lab. Of course, that's something that happens. But what we do know...
Which is critical. Teat condition is so important.
The teat is the primary defence the cow has against getting mastitis in the first place. So if there's something wrong with the integrity of the skin on her teats, just in the same way if you cut your hand, you're more susceptible to that getting infected than if it wasn't cut. It's exactly the same scenario. So often... it's where you get chafing or something that you'll get an infection. It's because the skin membrane is a huge part of your defence.
So, Natasha, what about in the spring with, spring mastitis? We always hear it's probably more environmental in the spring, that early period of lactation. You got strep urus, E. coli. Where would you go there?
I think from what we saw from the results would be that the iodines were definitely more effective against E. coli and Staph aureus, and I know you mentioned the spring and the challenge in the spring. Just because it's spring doesn't mean all the cases of mastitis will be, of course, strep urus and E. coli, but of course you're going to have a lot of mud, and so definitely a lot of them will be. So at any given time, I think, for us, the iodine really was the winner in terms of E. coli and Staph aureus. So as an all-rounder, that was the best one.
And summarising this, you really need to know what your herd challenge is when you look at teat spray. Staph aureus, if you do have staph in your herd, iodine is the way to go. Also, emollient levels are quite important. Make sure that they are operated at a reasonable level to achieve really good teat condition, because that's the cow's first defence. Great. I hope our listeners take those messages out of this. And, once again, Natasha, I think some of the work you're doing in New Zealand is really driving change and innovation. So great to have you as a guest again today.
Thank you, Colin.
Thanks for tuning in to Fill Your Boots. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered in today's episode, talk to your local FIL manager or head to fil.co.nz.